Yeah, since you've kind of touched on that, so what led up to this Sino-Soviet split, and what forces were behind it, and how detrimental was this for the left?
Well, it's interesting because when the Sino-Soviet split started, I would say that China was right. At the beginning, right? People say officially the Sino-Soviet split is about Stalin. That's not really what it's about, because the Sino-Soviet split didn't happen until 1961. Stalin died, and the secret speech by Khrushchev was in 1956, but it wasn't until 1961 the Sino-Soviet split happened. But it appeared that Khrushchev was announcing to the world that the United States has the atomic bomb. There's a danger of a nuclear war. So on that basis, the people in South Africa that are fighting apartheid, the people of Latin America fighting military juntas, the people of Asian countries that are fighting for their national liberation, they can no longer do that, right? That they should have détente, they should surrender and give up their weapons because the danger of a new world war is too great. And China did not agree with that. China was a country that had waged a revolutionary war and broken out of capitalism and all of that. And they were not going to settle for that, right? They believed in a global revolution to overthrow capitalism. And so China, they weren't going to have that. And they published some really amazing documents like Long Live Leninism, like Critique of the General Line of the Global Communist Movement. And they basically said, look, that yes, obviously we're not left adventurers. We don't advocate violence, but people in colonized countries that want their freedom and have no choice have the right to take up arms, and that socialist revolution is needed. Khrushchev's idea was that the way the Soviet Union would defeat the United States was they would just outproduce them in consumer goods. Well, look how well that turned out, but called it peaceful competition. Well, and Mao and the global communist movement was largely saying the opposite. And so China started condemning the Soviet Union for these policies. The Soviet Union then pulled out all their aid from China, right? Buildings were left half built. It caused a huge amount of economic problems in China. And a lot of countries were neutral. North Korea was neutral. Cuba was neutral. And it was pretty bad. So it started out, I would say that China was in the right. However, over the course of the next decade, China started, in the name of being ultra-revolutionary, aligning with the United States, imperialists against the Soviet Union. And so, and really the first time it happened was in Angola, right? In Angola, you had, there was the MPLA, which was the communist group that was fighting against Portuguese colonialists and eventually became the government in 1975. The CIA was backing a counter gang called UNITA, right, led by Jonas Savimbi. Well, everyone knew that this group of, it was called the Union for the Total Liberation of Angola. It was led by a guy named Jonas Savimbi, who was a literal cannibal, by the way. He ate people, just FYI. A guy named Jonas Savimbi was being armed by the United States to fight against the MPLA. And China started giving military aid to Jonas Savimbi. Even though he was known to be CIA, on the grounds that, well, the MPLA, they're allies of the Soviet Union. That was the first time, right? Then you had 1973, you had the coup where Pinochet took power in Chile, and you had China recognizing and embracing Pinochet. At the time, the Shah of Iran was known to be a US-backed dictator. Well, the Shah's relatives would go to Iran and get a big parade. Mengistu was the US-backed dictator of Ethiopia. China was very friendly to Mengistu. And that in the name of being anti-Soviet, China was aligning with the United States, right? And that was done probably out of desperation, out of the fact that China was a very poor country and the Soviet Union had isolated them in the global communist movement. The only country that really was allowed to full on have trade relations with them was Albania, right? So as a result of the Soviet Union kind of maneuvering against China, as a result of that, China started cozying up to the US imperialists. And it started with Mao. People make it sound like this is all Deng Xiaoping. No, it started during the Mao era, 1969. And it gradually got worse. Richard Nixon went to China and was given a big parade. Anywhere he would have gone in the United States, he would have had a big protest against him by anti-war activists, but he went to China, a communist country, and was treated as a hero. And that Henry Kissinger wrote about how his strategy for defeating the Soviet Union was utilizing China as an ally against the Soviet Union. And this is how the USA was able to win the Cold War. It was manipulating communists against each other. The saddest example is the Kampuchea War. So the USA was defeated in Vietnam, pulls out of Vietnam. And for years, I've heard this, right? Bush said this, you know, right-wing Vietnam vets said this. Well, you know, after the USA left Vietnam, the communists killed way more people than you know, the US. That's a talking point. Well, what happened, right? So the USA pulls out of Vietnam, but the USA is giving guns and weapons to Pol Pot.
Pol Pot.
Mm-hmm.
And Pol Pot, right, is a crazy ultra-leftist, basically an anarchist, right? He thinks that Cambodia can have socialism without industry. They can have socialism on the basis of being agrarian. He forcibly evacuates the cities, you know, starts executing people for wearing glasses. And, you know, he's this crazy, bloodthirsty ultra-leftist. He kills the pro-Soviet and the, like, Marxist-Leninist wing of his own party. And he's got this bloodthirsty agrarian peasant revenge, you know, bloodbath going on in Cambodia. He starts attacking Vietnam. So Vietnam responds and goes in to try and rescue some of the legit communists in Cambodia. So then China invades Vietnam in order to support the Kampuchea and Pol Pot. And so in Southeast Asia, yes, a lot of people get killed, but it's because the CIA is backing Pol Pot, and the CIA has maneuvered China into being pro-US, and communists are being covertly supported to kill other communists. And yeah, there's a bloodbath, you know, in the late 70s in Southeast Asia because of CIA manipulation and covert efforts. And that was, you know, the Pentagon was seen as losing in Vietnam. So the covert wing of American intelligence, Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski, started running US foreign policy. And they said, we've got to manipulate communists against each other. Let's not attack the Soviets. Let's stand back and covertly manipulate them against each other. And it worked. It worked very effectively. And this was the liberals. And this is what people don't understand. You know, at Black Agenda Report, the website, they have a term for liberals. They call them the more effective evil. And I think that's true. The liberals are the more effective evil.
Yeah, I agree. 100% I agree. A lot of my friends are like, why do you go so hard for liberals? Are you a Republican? Why are you so mean to liberals? And well, I personally think liberals are more dangerous than Republicans.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, look at the death and destruction they've helped leave all over the world.
Yeah.
You know, there are two aisles of the same wing of the right wing of the plane that they're.
Yeah, no, I you know, a lot of people like to say that there's this so-called red-brown alliance bullshit. But I heard Ben Norton talk about this, and there's a blue-brown alliance, and that's been historically accurate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ukraine, right?
Ukraine, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I bring nobody wants to listen to me when I bring that up either. I talk about the open slave trade that's Hillary Clinton's State Department left in Libya. They don't want to talk about the Azov battalion. I try to tell them about how the petrodollar bullshit that we have with Saudi Arabia, and they're like, oh, the Uyghurs in China. I'm just like, well, okay, but there's actual terrorism happening there for a reason, because we want to destabilize the region, so we're giving terrorists weapons. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear that, like, their hero Hillary Clinton is
a blue-brown.
Right? Yeah. They don't like hearing it. So I don't know. I'll until if my last words are "fuck Hillary Clinton." I mean, I'm fine with that.
I mean, I don't know if I would necessarily say the liberals are the worst, right? At this point,
Right.
they seem to be, but that could change, right? I mean, during the Roosevelt years, the liberals were much better, right? And it changed, right? And that I think the problem is that for so long, the left and the communist movement has assumed that the only people they can ever recruit or influence are the, like, fringe of the Democratic Party, right? It's like people that are liberals, but, like, really liberal. A friend of mine moved to China, and he said, you know, in the United States, we think that if you're a communist, right, so we have conservatives and we have liberals. And then if you're really liberal, you might become a communist, right? That's not the way communists are in, like, the rest of the planet, right? That is a totally U.S. formation. The communists are the ultra liberals. No, we're not. I mean, we have our own viewpoint, right? And that if you just operate on this assumption that we are the most far left fringe of the Democratic Party, I mean, you've written off the overwhelming majority of the population. You know, I mean, but that's the Cold War mindset. And during the Cold War, I mean, that's kind of the role that liberals played, you know, and there was a huge labor aristocracy, and that's what they were reduced to doing. But we don't live in those times anymore. Capitalism is in crisis. The labor aristocracy is dying. We need new tactics for a new situation. You know, Lenin, he wrote that if the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours. Well, I look at the existing communist groups and I realize they haven't changed their tactics in 40 years. Well, you know, I mean, I mean, it's time for an update. And this assumption that middle America, that average Americans who are losing their jobs and homes are all a bunch of racist Ku Klux Klan white trash who would never want to join us, never want to listen to what we have to say, that's wrong, right? I mean, people are more open to actual Marxist politics than ever before. But there is this layer of destructive, chaotic, synthetic left that average Americans really don't like for some darn good reasons, you know? I mean,
absolutely. And I think it's wrong to think that progressive movements can't come out of the Republican Party either. Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party came out of the Republican Party. My grandmother she doesn't agree with war, so who do you think she supported in 2016? It's like those things aren't obvious to liberals. They think because that you know, they believe in healthcare that they're somehow better, but I think that's really destructive, and I think that's counterintuitive to our goals as socialists. I think that people are inherently good, and that we are trying to build a future with each other.
Yes,
we have.
Go on.
Oh no, I was just going to be on my like pedestal and just like, oh, we've got to work together, guys. But we've also got to like really like admit where wrong is happening. You know, as socialists, they're like, oh, Stalin killed all these people. You've got to denounce him and stuff like that. But they'll never, ever denounce anybody like Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton.
But it's funny because they're the ones that are actually doing it. That actually didn't happen. That's the thing. They're believing, actually, what they're actually believing is Nazi propaganda. You know, the whole Holodomor, you know, stop. It was deliberate. No, that's actually Nazi propaganda, Ukrainian Nazi propaganda.
I don't like to get into the specifics of that personally, because, you know, I know a lot of people from the Soviet Union who did have relatives who suffered, and I don't want to deny that bad things happened and that things happened. I just think that that's not the whole story, and the way it is presented, the narrative where it's communism killed gajillion people, you know, the big number they come up with, that narrative is so ridiculous.
It's so wrong.
It's so wrong. No. I mean, and we're not denying that it happened. We're just saying this wasn't a deliberate famine. There were natural causes to it. And this, you know,
policies may have contributed to it too. I think that the important point, though, is that it's the Soviet Union that cured famines. It's the Soviet Union that
privatization, like
right, exactly.
Yeah. The narrative that communism came in so people starved, or this was. I mean, it's really interesting because there was a famine in the entire USSR.
But there were famines even before that, though. That's the thing. It just happened with Stalin. Like there were famines.
Right wing, they have this narrative that Stalin hated Ukrainians so much that he got into office and said, all right, I'm going to starve me some Ukrainians. That's so far out of touch from what even could have happened, right? You know, that were there policies that were problematic. Of course, I mean, things happen, and I'm sure that there are things that Soviet leaders wish they hadn't done or could have done better, but the narrative that we get that this was an intentional maniacal policy specifically targeting Ukraine because Stalin hated Ukraine with all his might. This is a nationalist narrative that doesn't check out, right? I mean, if you look into the historical details.
Oh, but you know who actually did intentionally starve people? Churchill. Okay.
Yeah.
Talk about that. But yeah, I know we're ranting now. We're on a rant. But yeah, no one's.
It's just so frustrating. It's just so frustrating that we're constantly berated by.
The opposite is true. The opposite is true. It's actually the people that liberals kind of enshrine as these great leaders and people were actually the murderers. They're
right. It's weird because if you're arguing with one of them, right, you'll point this out about Winston Churchill, and they'll just say, fuck Winston Churchill. Okay, but you say that now, but they don't shame people for admiring Winston Churchill the same way, right? You know, for the sake of the argument, they'll just, oh yeah, okay, you're right about Winston Churchill, but no. Like, if a British person admires Winston Churchill, that doesn't automatically make them a Nazi and a Nazgul and needs to be canceled for the rest of their lives. If an American person admires, you know, Lyndon Johnson, there was a Broadway musical about Lyndon Johnson. I mean, it was all about Lyndon Johnson, this great liberal president. I mean, Lyndon Johnson killed millions of people in Vietnam. No shaming, you know. I bet you there's all kinds of bread tubers and Vosh fans that bought tickets to the Lyndon Johnson musical and sat there on Broadway, you know, and there's no shaming of that, right? You know, but if you say to them, oh, Lyndon Johnson, they're like, okay, fuck Lyndon Johnson, but Stalin, it's like, no, like, you don't understand, right? That liking Stalin, liking Mao makes you toxic forever. But liking these Western imperialist leaders is seen as just well, okay, maybe you're not as left, and that's the double standard. They really do buy into this narrative that the West is the best. I mean, that's what the Proud Boys, the racist Proud Boys, chant at their rallies. They chant, West is the best, right? And that's really what the synthetic leftists believe. They believe that we have it, you know, the best, we're the most free people in the world, it's the best system, and that all the people around the world that are resisting American imperialism and American capitalism and Western domination are somehow worse, right? They're worse. They accept that premise as the basis of the discussion. And until we can undermine that premise, right, that all the resistance to Western capitalism is somehow worse, until we can undermine that premise, we really can't have a foreign policy conversation, I don't think.
Right, and that's why I would like to promote Grover Furr's books. Really debunks the anti-Stalin paradigm very thoroughly.
We recently did an interview with him. He's a really sweet guy. He was really nice.
I really like Grover a lot. I've had dinner with him many times. Very friendly fellow.
He's absolutely,
and he's very accessible. He will do an interview. You call him up and he'll do an interview. So and the right wing folks. I mean, I remember I was at his office one time. And he walked out of his office, and I said, "What's the deal?" And he said, "Oh, some right-wing guy was calling me up." So I was explaining to him about all of it. Like, really? Like, right-wing people call his desk all the time to yell at him, and he sits there and talks with them and engages with them.
It's unbelievable. So nice. He's such a good person. I highly recommend it.
We gotta follow up with him.
I know.
So on the West is best kind of stuff, one thing I see liberals and conservatives really united on is China. China bad. China did the big bad. So I see them I'm sure you read a lot of liberal media about China, and maybe you've noticed that they always only refer to China as a kind of a racial class instead of an economic class, it seems. Have you noticed this? Do you think that they're trying to do this to manufacture consent for war and sanctions? And what is Silicon Valley and the Democratic Party's role in this new Cold War? And is there any connection to China's Huawei?
Well, I mean, Huawei is a major competitor with Silicon Valley, specifically with Apple, right? I mean, Apple can't stand Huawei. And Apple seems to really get in with Donald Trump when Donald Trump started his trade war, specifically with China, but most specifically targeting Huawei. Apple presents itself as a very liberal corporation, but when Trump started going for Huawei, the CEO of Apple, I believe Tim Cook is his name, started hanging out at the White House with Trump, and that was leaked, and Apple wasn't particularly proud of that because they have a liberal image, but they really were all about Trump. Trump and Tim Cook were really getting along. But I think that overwhelmingly, though, Apple is hardware, right? But in terms of the tech giants and all of that, their feeling is that Russia is the main threat. And I've said this before, that it seems like the Republicans, they want to focus on China. Democrats want to focus on Russia. Both of them hate them both, right? But it's a matter of whose priority. And that I think that, Silicon Valley and the tech monopolies, they see China as a country that has, you know, 1 billion people in it. And that 1 billion people could all have Facebook pages and Twitters, right? And the CIA is thinking, if we could get all the Chinese people on Facebook and Twitter, we could have a Chinese color revolution the next week, you know. So their approach is they want to kind of get a little friendlier to China, right? And build up American influence. And we saw that during the Obama administration. The Obama administration really made a point of being friendly to China, right? Praising, there was the Three Body Problem, which is a sci-fi novel that was a bestseller in China, and Obama praised it and said he read it, he loved it. And, you know, he would give little nods of approval to China, praise them for, you know, Confucius and the first civil service examination and such. The hope was to build up the strength of kind of pro-US institutions within China, right? There's some think tanks in China sponsored by the Ford Foundation that push China to be less anti-imperialist and more free market. And the idea was that if Obama could get friendlier, American influence in China would expand. Maybe Silicon Valley could, you know, assimilate and get China signed up. And that tended to be their approach. Also, I think that the big oil companies see China as a potential purchaser because China is an oil importer, not an oil exporter. However, Russia, on the other hand, is an oil exporting country that's in competition with big oil. And you know, Russia is a country that I think that the United States doesn't have as much of an apparatus of supporters and influencers within. Right. I think in Russia, you know, there's not a huge, you know, there aren't huge think tanks and huge American companies with factories and stuff like that. So I think that the intelligence wing, Silicon Valley, you know, big oil sees Russia as their main enemy. It's American manufacturers, Apple, hardware, military corporations. They tend to see China as their main competitor. But at the end of the day, I mean, they both don't like both of them, right? I mean, both of them are competitors with American capitalism. It's just a question of who should get priority. And I think that, yeah, the Biden wing probably is less aggressive against China. Though you'll remember during the election, they were constantly trying to outdo Trump in their anti-China rhetoric, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, it goes back and forth. So you really don't know at the end of the day. But, you know, and you know, I mean, remember that who was it who established diplomatic relations or established the road to getting diplomatic relations with China? It was Richard Nixon. And that was because no Democrat could ever have done that. If any Democrat had gone and had tea with Mao, he would just be castigated in the media endlessly. But it took a hard right-wing Republican to get the ball rolling that way. And so, you know, Joe Biden, on the other hand, right, he's not being accused of Russian meddling, right? And it may be Joe Biden who has things get better with Russia, right? That often politicians are more influenced by what they're accused of and what they don't want to be castigated for doing rather than it's very complicated. You know, many people have pointed out Democrats are the ones that start the wars. Why? Because they're constantly being accused of being soft, right? I mean, Democrats start the wars, right? That's a very common observation. So, politicians often act defensively to do the opposite of what they're accused of doing. So we really don't know. Joe Biden is entering office being accused by Republicans of being soft on China. So to prove he's not, he may be harder on China, right? Donald Trump was accused of being soft on Russia. So he was the most anti-Russian president we've had since the Cold War. I mean, my goodness, he ripped up the Clear Skies Treaty. He ripped up the short-range nuclear, missile treaty. I mean, he ripped up every nuclear treaty you can imagine. Sent lethal weapons to Ukraine, to the Ukrainian forces, which Obama would never do. I mean, Trump. I mean, my employers, RT, were forced to register as foreign agents. We were forced to register as foreign agents, basically, and that restricted our access as journalists to Capitol Hill and other things. We're designated as foreign lobbyists, even though we're just doing our jobs as journalists. I mean, this is the Trump administration that did all this to prove that, they call us, soft on Russia. Obama never did any of that stuff. So, it shows that the way politics works, often voting for somebody based on what they say is not the way to get the result you want. Things happen because of the balance of forces.
Right. And you wrote a book recently called Kamala Harris and the Future of America. And you point out in your book that, and I think this is really safe to say because no other politician has used their childhood as a talking point as much as Kamala Harris has throughout her whole campaign. And you also point out in your book that there seems to be a lot of rage there that stems from that. Walk us through the conditions that created Kamala Harris, and why is she more dangerous than Biden, and how throughout her career has she unleashed her vengeful rage to her advantage?
Well, here's the thing, right? Some people look at my book and look at some of the things I've said about Kamala Harris, and they say, Caleb, Kamala Harris's childhood or family, that's none of your business. Don't go there. The thing is, the only reason I'm going there is because she goes there constantly. She sells t-shirts with a picture of 10-year-old Kamala Harris on them, right? I mean, her ads, her videos, it's all about vote for me because I was once a very small child. I mean, it's bizarre. Never have we seen a candidate who talks about their childhood so much, okay?
Never.
It's weird. I mean, it's just weird, right? It's bizarre. And so you have to wonder, what's going on there, right? And so that makes it fair at that point to ask a question, I think, about a woman who could very well be our next president, will be our next vice president. That makes it fair game, I think, right? She brought it up, right, as they say. And based on that, someone tipped me off. I won't say who, but a rather prominent individual who was a Marxist and an academic tipped me off to the fact that her father is also a Marxist academic. Is one of the top Marxian economists in the field in the United States. His name is Donald Harris, and that Donald Harris is a Jamaican who moved to the United States and studied economics. And he met Kamala Harris's mother at anti-war protests in the early 60s in Berkeley and civil rights marches. And they were married. They had 2 children, Kamala and her sister. And then there was a divorce. Now, Kamala, in her autobiography, she says that the only thing that her parents fought over was the books. Well, that's not true, right? There was actually a very long, ugly custody battle in which Donald Harris was trying to, gain custody rights to his daughters, and he lost custody. He was not able to be part of his daughters' lives, really, from the time Kamala was about 10 years old, for the rest of their childhoods. And you'll notice that Kamala mentions her father only in passing. She doesn't say much about it, right? She talks about her mother a lot. Her mother is a saint. Her mother, is this woman from India, became a cancer researcher, feminist icon. There are memes of her mother. It's a whole thing. The other thing is that during the presidential campaign of Kamala Harris, her father, Donald Harris, denounced her. Right? Now, he came to the media and he denounced her presidential campaign. He said he described it as identity politics and a travesty. And he did not support his daughter. Now, that's a big deal. And someone's running for president of the United States and getting all the mainstream play that Kamala gets for their estranged father to step in and tell the media, yeah, I don't approve. And that's a pretty big deal. Well, the more you look into it, it's pretty clear that if you listen to Kamala Harris talk, there's a number of instances where she's talking about decisions she's made in her political career, like the decision to lock up the parents of children who were truant from school. That's something she did, right? And she will invoke her own childhood in order to justify that decision. That strikes me as indicating that there is some real anger there. There is some burning rage and there is some resentment. And that is deeply unhealthy. And if you listen to that tone of voice that Kamala gets when she is fired up and yelling and condemning people, it sounds to me like something pretty bad happened to little Kamala. We don't know what it was. We can only speculate. Something bad happened beyond just the racial discrimination that she experienced as a student going to an integrated school, as having neighbors that couldn't play with her because she was not white, etc. I think that there's a lot more there that we don't know about, and that she very much sees herself. It's very clear the way she presents her childhood and herself. She sees herself as a victim, right? She's been victimized by this world. She's experienced some rather extreme hardship in her life of some degree. She's suffered. And that if you look at her career, how she became a criminal prosecutor, how she was so excited to execute somebody, that she tried to execute a man in California and prevent DNA evidence from being admitted, because it might exonerate him. She was so, thrilled about the idea that she might kill someone, not at all concerned that she might kill an innocent person. Attempted murder, right? I mean, if you look at that level of bloodthirsty desire to punish and take revenge is really pathological, right? But in my book, I make the point that in a lot of ways, if you take scientific socialism and economics and dialectical and historical materialism out of leftist politics, that's what you get. You get what I call a crude Freudian manipulation. You get, people being given permission to unleash their rage, foment chaos, engage in acts of destruction in response to perceived injustices that they have endured, real or perceived. And that in a lot of the call-out culture that we see on the left, that's what we see. It's not about changing anybody's mind. It's not about changing the world. It's about, calling out those bad people. I jokingly like to talk about, you talk about the college freshman or the college sophomore who's just taken gender or race studies, and they just feel so excited, and they're like, Mom and Dad, you're racist. You're racist, Mom and Dad. You're sexist. You're homo. And they just feel so excited that their parents are wrong, right? And it's a liberating feeling, right? That their parents are politically incorrect, they're racially insensitive, they're traditional, and it's this liberating feeling, right? And that the reality is that leftist politics and Marxist politics for decades and centuries has been tapping into these kind of feelings of rebellion among young people, right? The desire to rebel, to break tradition, to tear things down, to stand up against injustice. These are kind of the sentiments that leftism has tapped into. Well, if you take the concrete, scientific Marxism out of that, and you just reduce it to that, right? You've got something very dangerous, right? And that it's something that faction that I talk about, the chaos faction, the Silicon Valley fascists have really figured out how to harness that destructive impulse that exists within all of us. I think it's a part of growing up. It's a part of being human. We all have anger. We all have rage. We all have feelings about wanting to do things that we weren't permitted to do, or wanting to take revenge on people who harmed us, or but just tapping into those feelings. When politics simply becomes about tapping in and unleashing those feelings, it's not about Marxism, not about all the stuff that leftist politics is really about. It just becomes about that psychological manipulation. That's very dangerous. And I see Kamala Harris as kind of the culmination of that. Kamala Harris isn't a communist. She's not a socialist. She's not even really much of a liberal, economically speaking. But she is somebody who, when it comes to the emotional manipulation that is associated with leftism, that's the Cultural Revolution, that's the French Revolution and the guillotine. That's Kamala Harris, right? She is all about this particular psychological manipulation that has been a big part of leftist politics for so long, and I think needs to be reconsidered, because working people overwhelmingly don't want chaos. They want order. They want stability. It's capitalism that's making their lives chaotic, and socialism is the promise of making their lives not chaotic and not scary anymore. And so I think we need to reconfigure the psychological approach that socialism has. And maybe instead of appealing to people's desire for chaos, we should appeal to people's desire for a responsible, protective authority figure that steps in to make things right, rather than people's desire to tear things down and blow things up.
Right, and we kind of touched on this in the beginning, the earlier part of this interview, but I just want to make sure we really address this thoroughly here. I kind of want to talk about what are the actual divisions and factions of the ruling class, and how should socialists maneuver within this under a coming Biden and Harris administration?
Well, I think the way the divisions play out, I think there's a very good book that I read. It's by Carl Oglesby, who was a leader of Students for a Democratic Society. And in the 1970s, he published a book called The Yankee and Cowboy War. And it's a very good book, and it talks about the 1960s and the political crisis as a fight between the Yankees, or the Eastern establishment, the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, the Carnegies, the entrenched, wealthy families of New England, versus he refers to the cowboys, that being the weapons manufacturers, the the folks out west, the Texas oil men that are in competition with the big super major oil companies, that the lower levels of capital, he calls them the cowboys, and that this is the divide, right? And that Nixon was for the cowboys, and the Democrats were for the Yankees and the Eastern establishment. And I think that's pretty accurate in assessing the American political divide during that time. Things have changed because Silicon Valley has been set up since that book was published, right? And that Silicon Valley was set up by the intelligence apparatus. So it was originally started as kind of a wing of the Rockefeller Eastern Establishment intelligence agency wing of American politics, but it very much has an axis of its own at this point. Silicon Valley is its own axis, and there are times when Silicon Valley and Wall Street don't totally get along. But basically, I see the alignment as the Eastern Establishment of New England and Silicon Valley against the majority of American capitalists. The majority of American millionaires and billionaires just want to make money, and they like Trump because Trump is pushing back the more managerial wing of, Wall Street oil bankers and tech monopolies. The tech monopolies and the big oil companies, they tend to be with the Democrats, and the rest of the ruling class tends to favor a more libertarian approach where they can maximize their profits. But Silicon Valley was a big game changer, right? The rise of Facebook and Twitter has really put Silicon Valley way ahead of the rest of the ruling class, right? That the amount of power they have in influencing the way people think is way bigger than the owner of some hotel chain, for example, has, right? And that the managerial wing of the ruling class has the upper hand at this point. The wing that favors, covert action to try and stabilize the United States, and prevent any kind of revolution or anything like that from breaking out, but also spread chaos around the world in order to secure the rule of Western monopoly corporations. That faction has the upper hand, mainly because of the computer revolution. But they are facing a very solid, layer of resistance of capitalists that don't want to pay higher taxes, of capitalists that just want to make profits and don't like the fact that the government is involved. I think most capitalists have a more or less libertarian approach, right? They got rich. Anyone else could get rich too if they just work hard enough, right? And they want the government to stay out, and they want free competition. But the richest of the rich, they're going to get the government monopoly anyway, right? So they're not worried about the government getting involved. Plus, they're thinking long term. What could possibly unseat them would be big social unrest, would be the rise of geopolitical rivals in the United States. They're thinking strategically and long term and managerially, and the rest of the ruling class is thinking about their own profits in the short term. During slavery, there was a debate among slave ship owners, and they argued about, should you pack the slave ships to full capacity and have all the slaves die, a number of the slaves die on the way to the United States, or should you not pack the ships to full capacity so that more of the slaves survived by the time you got back to the United States, right? And that was a big debate among the slave ship owners. Some of them said, pack the ship as tightly as you can, and some of them said, don't pack the ship as tight as you can. These are the kind of arguments the ruling class has among themselves, right? At the end of the day, their goal is maximizing their profits and ruling, but the question is, how do we do it? And do we have a long-term or short-term approach? How do we get what we want?
That's abhorrent. That's abhorrent.
But this is how the capitalists operate. And this is the system that we live under. And ultimately, the future of the working class is with neither faction. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be a strategic alliance at some point. Right. However, I'm at the point where I think that the relationship, the kind of attachment that socialists and leftists have to the Democratic Party and the Eastern establishment needs to break. Now, that doesn't mean aligning with Trump, but you never enter an alliance with somebody unless you have your own resources, right? You know what I'm saying? You never enter an alliance unless you have enough of your own to go into that alliance, to actually be a partner in it, right? And the left is so weak, and actual Marxism is so weak, that entering an alliance with the Eastern establishment, with the Democratic National Committee, all it means is we're their foot soldiers. We don't have any say. We don't have any influence over how they do things, right? And they have made overwhelmingly clear they don't really want us. That's kind of what we were talking about before with Biden and all of that. So if you're a progressive and you're a socialist, I urge you to rethink the relationship with the Democratic Party. I argue that we need to get to the masses. It's the broad masses of people, average Americans who've never met a socialist, never met a communist, but are suffering economically right now. That's who we need to get to. And we urgently need to get to them, right? That's who we need to get to. We need to get to the broad masses of people. I've repeated the phrase over and over again, out of the movement to the masses. That's where we need to be, right? Average Americans who are living in Kansas and Iowa and New Hampshire and Mississippi and Alabama and Texas and San Diego and Sacramento who are suffering right now and are looking for answers need to turn to revolutionary scientific socialism for those answers. And that is the role that I see leftists playing in our time. And part of that means not only breaking with the Eastern establishment in Silicon Valley, but breaking with the synthetic left. Because, they look at the Antifa, Vosh fan club, people out in the streets breaking things and burning the American flag, and they don't want anything to do with that, right? Would you want that in your community, in your neighborhood? I mean, nobody would want that, right? And that, I wear a suit. I get a lot of flack for wearing a suit, but, I went in 2013 to the World Festival of Youth and Students in Quito, Ecuador. And I met with communists from Venezuela and communists from Angola and communists from India and communists from all over the world, places where they have millions of people who follow them and they control governments and have seats in governments and have labor unions and stuff. And, they were all wearing suits, you know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm sorry, but it's like, if we want to keep being bohemian, isolated fringe that go out and break things on cue when it starts lighting up on Twitter, well, there's no future in that for socialism. The future for socialism is getting to the masses, building real organizations that care for people and provide services to people, right? And build up a force of community power. And then from there can start to talk about how we transition to a socialist society.
Yeah, because there definitely seems to be this tendency among on the left and there's definitely a tendency on the left that cling to a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to socialism and what that looks like. And you talk a lot about socialism with American characteristics. So what does that look like, and what are the material conditions that are unique to America?
Well, I debated Destiny, Stephen Bonnell, this video game playing guy, and he wanted like a blueprint. He wanted exactly exactly how much, French fries you get in the Socialist Society's restaurant when you order a hamburger, and I try not to do that, because the thing is that socialism will come about as a result of the American people in their millions coming into motion and fighting for it and building it. So, blueprints can only go so far. Right. And that the reason I'm talking about socialism with American characteristics is because we need to acknowledge that when socialism comes to the United States, it will be to address the contradictions of U.S. society. It will be because the people of this country decided that they wanted it and fought to bring it into being. So it's going to be unique. It's going to be specific to our conditions. Right. And, Mao very much changed socialism and Marxism for China. He didn't copy the Soviet Union. Right? Bolivarianism is very, very specific to Latin America. It's a new thing. Ba'athist Arab socialism in the Arab world, it acknowledges the role of Islam and Arabism and has a very important history. And that everywhere that we've seen socialism be victorious, it has adjusted for the place that it comes into existence, right? And we need to talk about doing that in the United States. We are never going to have a Kim Il-sungist government in America. Sorry to burst your bubble. I've read Kim Il-sung's writings. I think North Korea is a country that there's plenty we can learn from in terms of how it has existed and struggled. But they're never going to have a Kim Il-sungist government. We're never going to have a Maoist government in the United States. We're never going to have, we need to figure out what American socialism will be. And I don't really know at the end of the day, right? But that's something we're going to figure out. There's a couple things that come to mind. I think that we'll have a big market sector, right? I mean, Americans are a very entrepreneurial people, right? I mean, we have immigrants here from all over the world who come here because they want to start a business. And in Nicaragua, they have a micro entrepreneurs program where they enable people, low-income Nicaraguans, to start their own businesses. I can only imagine that a socialist government in the United States would be empowering Americans to start tech companies and start tech firms and all that, all to work in line with a state centrally planned economy. But I think there would be a big market sector in the United States. I think that resolving the issues of race and the tensions we've had around race, and I think that would be important. I think religious freedom of expression, freedom to assemble, the civil rights. These things are very important to Americans. And I can't imagine any government ever coming to power here that didn't recognize, civil liberties. But I've often raised 4 demands that would be a transition to socialism. The first being, a mobilization of the population to rebuild the country. New highways, new bridges, new railways, new universities, new schools, just a mass program of reconstruction of the United States. The second would be taking public control of our natural resources. America's oil, America's coal, America's timber, America's natural gas. The profits from it should go into the public budget, right? It should be operated in a way that is in the long-term interest of the people of this country. The third would be public control of banking, so that credit was assigned by the state in the interests of the overall, needs of the country, not just a private banker trying to make profits from interest, right? And that if the state had a monopoly on credit, we could use the assigning of credit to strategically plan out the economy. And the fourth thing would be an implementation of the economic Bill of Rights that Roosevelt talked about: the right to a job, the right to housing, the right to healthcare. Those 4 steps, if you implemented them, that would not in and of itself be socialism. We would still, conceivably one could be still a capitalist country. But in order to achieve those 4 things, so much popular power would have to be created, and so much capitalist power would have to be pushed back, that socialism would be just around the corner, right? That would be a point of transition. If you look at the Bolivarian countries, the way that Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales and others came to power was they had elections that were like a referendum on free market neoliberalism. Are you for it or are you against it, right? Well, the people voted against it. They elected the socialist candidate. The socialist candidate then proceeded, after the population rejected neoliberalism, to transition towards socialism. I can see an election like that happening in the United States. Perhaps in the next 20, 30 years, we would get to the point that there'd be such a big class struggle and mobilization that we would have an election that was really a referendum on the insane system of capitalism and free markets, and we could elect some kind of popular front government or people's democratic government, an anti-monopoly state like William Z. Foster spoke about. And from there, in order for that government to stay in power, it would need to change the military. It would need to change the way the business communities operate, the intelligence agencies and the police. In order for a government that represented popular will against the ruling class to stay in power, it would be forced to move towards socialism, or it would be overthrown.
That's a great analysis. I really, really appreciate that. So kind of shifting gears, you've mentioned Iran several times, and that's clearly been, your experience in Iran has really impacted your worldview. And so I wanted to ask a couple questions about that, starting with nuclear energy. Why does Iran want nuclear energy so badly, and why would the USA not want Iran to develop nuclear energy?
Well, the reason Iran wants nuclear energy so badly is because of the fact that they're an oil exporting country. The oil that they use is oil they do not export, right? They want to maximize the amount of oil they export. So by developing nuclear energy, that means they consume less oil domestically. That's what that's about. And that by developing nuclear energy, they can expand their power system, use less of their own oil, and sell more oil on the international markets. And that's really what it's about, more than anything. Plus, nuclear energy is more efficient than coal. It doesn't deplete their natural resources as much. It pollutes less. I mean, I've been to Iran, and I'll tell you, Tehran is, it's a great country, great country, but whenever I was in that capital city of Tehran, I was taking so much allergy medicine and all of that, the amount of pollution, there's a lot of pollution, and they see nuclear energy as something that's better for Iran, right? And they have been in full compliance with the International Atomic Energy Agency. Every nuclear site in Iran is monitored 24 hours a day, surveillance video to make sure they're not doing anything that could weaponize it. And furthermore, they complied fully with the nuclear deal. They never broke it. And now the United States has pulled out of it. And the United States, they signed a deal with the United States, gave up most of their peaceful nuclear energy program. And the United States still pulled out of the deal. So yeah, that's the situation there. Israel doesn't want Iran to have nuclear power. I mean, the first thing is, First things first, okay? Israel likes to play up the idea that Iran is trying to get a nuclear bomb so it can nuke the whole world because they're crazy, scary ayatollahs and they're going to kill us all. So we should fight Iran, right? So there's a propaganda value to this, right? I mean, Israel has loads of nuclear weapons. It's, the USA, is actually in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty by giving aid to Israel the way it does, because Israel has violated, they're acquiring nuclear weapons, and, Israel's never signed the treaty, but the USA is not, permitted to support a country that is engaging in nuclear proliferation outside of the treaty. So the United States should immediately cut off aid to Israel if the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty really applied. But of course, Israel is the exception. But the idea, it's a propaganda value, right? We've all seen Netanyahu's speeches, and Iran is trying to get a bomb so they can blow up the world. We should all be terrified. It has a propaganda value. Number one. Number two, though, that oil is the reason Israel exists. Right? At the end of the day, the reason that the Middle East is such a valuable, important region is because of the oil resources, right? And that the reason that the British were so enthusiastic about Theodore Herzl and his project of creating a Jewish homeland was because it was in the strategic interest of Western capitalism to have a base of support in that region, to have a group of European settlers set up a country in the Middle East so they could, work in the interest of the West, in the Middle East. And actually, this was long before Israel was created. I mean, the Jewish settlers in Israel often worked for oil companies, and would fight against Palestinians and Arabs that were, trying to blow up oil pipelines and things like that. And the British military was sent to Palestine in 1936 to protect Jewish settlers from the Arabs, but this was also about pushing back Arab resistance to the British in the Middle East. And so that Israel functions as an outpost of Western capitalism and imperialism in that region, because that region is very valuable, because it has lots of oil. And Saudi Arabia is in a bit of a crisis right now, because with fracking, Saudi Arabia is no longer as important to Western capitalism as it once was. We have energy independence now. And Israel is facing a similar situation, I think. Israel is no longer as important to Western capitalism as it once was. And Israel knows that. So if nuclear power were to take off, if countries all over the world started having nuclear power, if China, continues to speed ahead with nuclear fusion, that's why they just went to the moon to get helium-3. If that were to happen, if oil were eliminated, fossil fuels were no longer the basis of our economy, there would really be no reason for the Western countries to prop up Israel any longer. And Israel knows that. Now, this is a very long-term, existential thing. I think in the short term, it's about propaganda value, right? It's about the fact that Iran is a backer of the Palestinians, right? That Iran is a backer of the people of Bahrain and their struggle for freedom and democracy. It's a backer of the people of Yemen. And because Iran is associated with so many people in the region that are fighting capitalism and imperialism, Israel wants Iran to be as weak as possible. And it wants to play up the idea that Iran is a barbaric country that's, that's going to kill us all or whatever. So I think it's got propaganda value. It's got short-term value, in terms of regional conflicts. But the bigger picture is about oil and the Middle East itself. The Soviet Union had a plan to irrigate the Middle East. They were going to build, huge irrigation pipelines to the Middle East. And they were going to irrigate the desert and make it so that Middle Eastern countries could have booming agriculture. Right? And the idea was to create peace between Israel and Palestine by industrializing the Middle East and greening the Middle East. And the Ba'ath countries were very excited about this. Saddam Hussein and Assad and others were very excited about this. There were even some forces in Israel that were sympathetic to doing that. But 78, when you had the government of Menachem Begin came into office, the Likud party, that was a turning point. And the conversation about that move to bring peace to the Middle East through economic development, which the Soviet Union was leading along with the Israeli Labor Party and with the Ba'ath countries, that project ended. It was terminated. And I think that was a really negative turning point. And from that point onward, the instability in that region really escalated, because the hope for, the way in any part of the world, the road to peace is always economic development. When people have jobs, when people have, schools and education, they don't join terrorist groups, they don't sell drugs, they generally, things get a little bit better. But when people are poor and desperate, that's when you get terrorism and instability and chaos and violence. And, you know, the Middle East functioning, I mean, you go to some of these countries, Saudi Arabia, you know, Qatar, you know, Bahrain, a lot of these countries have nothing but oil and sand. Okay, I mean, these are oil and sand countries. There's an autocratic regime backed by the United States with a big stockpile of US-made weapons and a bunch of American companies extracting their oil, and that's what they got. Well, if there's going to be peace in the Middle East, those countries need to have economic development, and that's what I saw in Iran. You wouldn't believe the level of industrialization that Iran has. I mean, the big highways that they have built, the big power plants, I mean, the beautiful cities and gardens. Iran is one of the most developed countries in that region. They've broken out of Western capitalism. They're still a major oil exporting country, but they have done a whole lot to build their own car manufacturing, to build their own steel manufacturing, to make their own cell phones. You know, Iran has really, really worked hard to not just be the oil colony of the West like it once was under the Shah.
So leading into my next question here, why should socialists support Iran in general, but also Iran's nuclear goals? I mean, it should be pretty self-evident by all the things you said, but is there anything else you would add to that?
Well, I mean, first of all, let's be careful about the word support. What does support mean, right? I mean, there are certainly policies in Iran that I don't approve of, and the Iranians are the first to tell you that they have problems in terms of human rights. There are aspects, you know, there some of the ways women are treated, some of the LGBT policies. There are things there that I don't agree with, and many Iranians don't agree with, and certainly need reform, right? Now, I don't think it's right for me as an American to go there and say, you need to change this, you need to change that, you know, but at the same time, you know, I mean, in terms of human rights, there are certainly areas they need to improve, okay? And so, you know, when you say support, it's not like I blindly support everything they do. I'm not a Muslim, you know, I'm a Christian. You know, I don't agree with their ideology. They have a Shia Muslim revolutionary perspective. But at the same time, I would say Iran is not a capitalist country. They insist they are not socialist. If you go there, I have had this conversation with them many times. They are adamant. They say we are neither socialist or capitalist. We are an Islamic system. One of the slogans that Khomeini used during the revolution is he said, not capitalism, but Islam. And neither East nor West, meaning they weren't for the Cold War and the communist on the communist side of the Cold War or for the West. So, but if you look at the way Iran's economy is set up, the biggest economic entity in the country is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is a military organization. On top of that, all the oil is so major in their economy, and it's all state-run. Car manufacturing is state-run. You know, steel manufacturing is state-run. Healthcare is state-run. The economy is very much centralized in the hands of the state. They have 5-year economic plans. They have these things called Basij councils in every neighborhood that are like community assemblies where they get together and talk about what the supreme leader wants, and they enforce the goals of the revolution on a community level. You know, they have pictures of Palestinian freedom fighters everywhere. They have pictures of Malcolm X everywhere. You know, I would say Iran is a country that has broken out of Western capitalism, and I guess they want to call their system not capitalism. I would say it's definitely not capitalism. You know, it's a revolutionary country. Now, the revolution is not a Marxist revolution. It's an Islamic revolution. But I think it's a progressive revolution in a progressive country. And on that basis, I think that socialists and leftists, while we might disagree with this or that aspect of it, I think that we can point to it as an example of a country that has broken free and achieved great things for its population, and points toward the hope for a new world. And if one country can break free, other countries can break free as well. And Iran can do it in a Muslim way, and the Bolivarians can do it in a Roman Catholic and indigenous way, and we'll eventually have to figure out our American way to do it over here. That's kind of how I view Iran.
Beautifully said. I appreciate you detailing all of that. That's something that's like been heavily on my mind, because somebody I know is a refugee from Iran, and so we talk about some of these things a lot, and it's just frustrating because she's like, yeah, America sucks, but I'm so mad at Iran. And
one thing that a number of Iranian refugees have told me, you know, because there are a lot of Iranians in New York City that are, you know, people that fled during the revolution. There's a number of them that are people that were in the Iranian Communist Party at one point. And what I thought was interesting is that a lot of Iranians who fled the country after the Islamic Revolution got the memo that it was safe to go home when Ahmadinejad got elected, right? And that Ahmadinejad, denounced capitalism in his speeches. He really emphasized anti-capitalism. And that there is a whole building in Iran called the House of Latin America, right? And it is a government building that facilitates Iran's relations with Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia, countries like that. And if you visit the House of Latin America, they've got pictures of Che Guevara on the wall. They've got pictures of Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro on the wall. The people there are very familiar with Karl Marx's writings. And there is no legal communist party, because a communist party would by definition not recognize Islam as the basis of the Iranian government. But there is something called the Islamic Labor Party, which is like an Islamic socialist party that has seats in the government. There are trade unions in Iran. And I'll tell you, Iran, as much as Marxism is not considered to be part of the ruling ideology, the people there know more about Marxism than Americans do. I mean, Marxism was a big deal in the Iranian Revolution. And if young Iranians, old Iranians, they know Marx, they know Lenin. I mean, there are TV programs where they explain Lenin's theory of imperialism in relation to Iran. There are TV commentators that are basically giving a Leninist understanding of imperialism and economics on television. That even though Iran is not a Marxist country, there is a huge, huge Marxist influence on the Islamic Revolution, no question about it. And I think that there are many people within the Islamic Republic who are very, very heavily influenced by Marxism, though they are not Marxists themselves, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. One last question to wrap up my Iran section here. How do you think nuclear energy is compatible with a socialist system, and do you think it has a place in what an American socialist country looks like?
Well, I mean, I think any potential fuel source, right? We need to get to a higher source of energy than fossil fuels. Global warming is a reality. It's absolutely a reality. Fossil fuels are not a sustainable way of running our economy. Nuclear energy, as it currently exists, I mean, it has problems with nuclear waste and all of that, but it's better than fossil fuels for the environment. There's no question it's better than fossil fuels. It's just, it has problems, but nuclear fusion, cold fusion, right? That could really be a big game changer. And that is why China has poured so much money and research into it. Humanity lives under a prison called fossil fuels. And that's how Wall Street stays at the center of the global economy. It's the big oil companies that are also the big banks. ExxonMobil, that's Chase Bank, that's the Rockefellers and the Morgans, right? You got BP, that's HSBC Bank, that's the Rothschilds. I know I'm not mentioning that for any ethnic reason. That's who they are, right? And the reason that Western banks dominate the global economy is because of the fact that oil is what the world is based on. Most of the environmental movement has a Malthusian perspective and says we've gone too far, we're using too many resources, we need to reduce the population, we need to reduce consumption. I say the opposite. I say humanity needs to go higher. We can do better, right? We need to get beyond fossil fuels, get to a higher energy source. And humans are capable of doing that, right? And the fact that China is loading up their spacecraft on the moon right now, right? With helium-3. There's talk about mining asteroids. I know that sounds science fiction and crazy, but it could happen, right? People talk about, getting resources from Mars, right? We need to, as a species, look, we find a way. I did a whole video about Jurassic Park and Michael Crichton. And the big line from Jurassic Park is life found a way. Well, humans find a way, right? We do. I mean, we are a progressive species. We always are looking to improve things. I've said many times that beavers have been building their dams the same way for thousands of years. Ants have been building their ant farms the same way for thousands of years. But human beings have gone from living in the caves and hunting and gathering to space travel and iPhones. We've done that in just a few thousand years. There's something special about the human race. We have a streak of creativity and brilliance that really sets us apart from other species. We're not just another animal. as some of the Silicon Valley fascists would like us to believe. We are really a special entity. There's no other species like us in the universe that I know of. And because of that, I don't think that we can say that human beings are just, well, you know, we've gone too far and we start rolling back the wheels of history. It doesn't work like that. Even if you wanted it to work that way, it doesn't work, right? You know, the only way we can move is to move forward. Time travel is a great thing on TV shows, but reality, time only moves one way, forward. And so because of that, you know, we need to figure out a higher fuel source. We need to, you know, look into nuclear energy and other forms of energy, right? And I like solar panels. I like windmills. They're great, but they're not enough, right? You know, they're not a higher fuel source. If you can't replace, you know, coal and natural gas with you know, windmills and solar panels.
Right.
But you could potentially do it with a better form of nuclear power.
Yeah, and speaking of animals, I think we're in this new awakening period on the left. I think people are taking into consideration that animals are also non-human animals are also victims of the capitalist system as well, and I think we're in this period of we're in the period of the animal question, I think. So what are your thoughts on the anti-speciest and vegan movement?
Well, it's really interesting because I actually became very good friends with a very, very dedicated vegan when I was in college. When I was in college, I lived in a dorm, and I always hung a lot of communist propaganda on my dorm room door, right? You know, people would walk by and see it. And there were a lot of athletes in my dorm who didn't particularly like that, who would like draw penises on my posters and, you know, just be kind of immature. And then one semester, I was living in the same dorm. I came back after winter break and all the harassment stopped. And I thought, why is no one drawing any penises on my wall? Why is nobody realizing you know, what's going on here? Well, the reason was because a vegan girl had moved in across the hall. And she had seen my communist posters and started putting up vegan posters. So suddenly they were kind of bored with harassing me. So they started harassing her, you know, and putting like, if you don't eat meat, move to another dorm. You know what I mean? Like, I love tasty animals, and, you know, just being nasty to her. So I became friends with her, actually, and she and her roommate were both vegans. And it was interesting, and we had some very interesting exchanges about you know, vegetarianism and veganism and all of that. And you know, and then I'll never forget, you know, when I was an activist in Cleveland, if there was any protest of any kind, I would go to it, right? Because I was, you know, there's not many protests in Cleveland. So, you know, if there was, I would go to it and try to talk to people about communism. So I don't know how I missed it. But one day, a friend of mine, we were driving through downtown Cleveland, and we looked over, and in front of a Kentucky Fried Chicken, there were a whole bunch of naked people. And we had no idea this was going to happen, but there were, you know, 20, 30 naked people in front of Kentucky Fried Chicken. And so we stopped the car, of course, and we got out, and this was a vegan protest. They were naked to draw awareness to the activities of Kentucky Fried Chicken and the way they treat their animals. And a lot of them were like suburban high school students, right? And I talked with them, and it was interesting because, you know, they were from some pretty upper, like, wealthy suburbs of Cleveland, but they had a deep understanding that something was inherently wrong with the society they lived in. They didn't have the understanding of the crimes of U.S. imperialism. They didn't have the understanding of dialectical and historical materialism. But they just had this gut feeling that something was wrong. And when they saw about factory farms and the way animals were treated, that they saw as an incarnation of this kind of feeling they had. You know, Shakespeare writes, there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. When I talked to these kind of wealthier suburban kids who were naked in front of the KFC, that was what it was, that they knew something was not right about the society they lived in. And the way it manifested itself was in this kind of PETA radical veganism, you know? And so that, you know, in and of itself, you know, I don't identify with that movement. I don't have a vegan diet, you know, I eat meat and such, but that has always kind of made me kind of have admiration and respect for people who kind of gravitate to that, right? Because it shows that there is some kind of consciousness. And I will say that, you know, one sign, throughout history, if someone's going to become a mass shooter, if someone's going to become a serial killer, one of the signs that they will do it is they start torturing animals, right? There's something, cruelty, right? When you're taking pleasure from inflicting pain on another person or another entity, right? Or another animal, right? There's something inherently wrong with that, right? And we all know that on like a gut level. When we see someone engaging in that kind of behavior, we know that something is wrong. So I think that, they may be getting at something that's worth exploring, right? I'm not where they're at currently, but I can respect them on that basis. And I think it's worth exploring. And I think it's worth understanding. And that, there's a lot of sadism in our country, you talk about the sadism to animals, and I think that sadism to animals and sadism to people can be connected, there's a lot of indifference to the suffering of others that goes on. And I feel like the way Hollywood can show very, very violent movies, that's kind of a way to psych the population up for war, right? There's a lot of different aspects of this. So I don't totally discount that stuff at all. I have some respect for it, even though it's not where I'm at. Is that an answer to your question?
Absolutely. I think like you said, I think there's definitely a big connection, and it's just about, making those connections with these people that are, might be more focused on the animal liberation, animal rights, and the other, other side, like the Marxist-Leninist side, understanding that there's a primary contradiction here, and that's the capitalist system and the current bourgeoisie dictatorship that's at the root of the suffering. And we need to come together in order to alleviate the suffering of not just human beings but non-human species. We need to deal with the primary contradiction first in order to mitigate the suffering of the non-human species.
It's also like a matter of public health too. COVID, like industrial animal farms were breeding grounds for
so sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, Fox, but I think a lot of the mainstream vegan movement is a lot about moralism and individualist acts, and that's not going to change the system. We need system change. We need socialism with American characteristics like what you're saying, in order to really change the primary contradiction, which is at the root cause of this.
I will say that every time I travel internationally for an extended period of time, I always come back and I've lost so much weight. So much weight. American food is not good for you, right? And I'm not eating super healthy when I go to Russia or when I go to Iran or I go to Venezuela. But if I'm in one of those countries for a month, I come back to the United States and it's like I've had like the best diet you wouldn't believe, right? Because our food here is so processed and it's so bad for you. Yeah, that is absolutely true. And I've seen it. And I've had friends who've become expatriates and moved to other countries, and they immediately get into way better shape because of the food they eat, right? That something about the way we do our food here is really wrong. In the little town that I grew up in, near there was a chicken factory, right? Where they made, they had chicken. And people would tell me that they would go work there, and the thing that they were taking care of and then, leading to slaughter, they said it didn't look like a chicken. It didn't have any feathers, right? It was just this weird, like, glob of flesh that had been genetically engineered to make good meat, they said that it was just unnatural, right? When you think of a chicken, you think of this thing with feathers that box and walks around, and there was this like unnatural, thing that had been bred, that was just bizarre. And something's not right about that. This can't be good for you.
No, we're ingesting that too. It's like it's like what they put into these animals is we ingest it, and it becomes part of us, and it has a negative impact on our health, and it's really bad for the environment. Like, we have no land because of big agriculture, because of animal agriculture.
And let's also talk about the fact that one of the things they inject into farm animals is hormones.
Exactly.
And there's a huge mental health crisis in our society. Well, I mean, do you think it helps that people are eating food, pumped up, synthetically full of hormones? I mean, that's not, if you're trying to have a population that's mentally healthy, you don't pump up their food full of hormones. So, I mean, the FDA and so much of what they do, I mean, there's a reason. I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but there's a reason people are, is they know that these institutions are not doing a good job representing them. And they know that big business gets away with all kinds of atrocities. I think there's a huge problem with over-medication too. I mean, these psych meds they put these kids on at a young age, a kid is being rebellious or misbehaving and they just, give them psych meds, I mean, and there's this huge over-medication nowadays. And yeah, I mean, what we're doing as a society, we're moving in a very, very unhealthy and dangerous direction. And the root of that, in my view, is profits, and the fact that profits are in command and profits come before people. And I think that needs to be resolved with socialism.
Exactly. Caleb, we really appreciate your time with us. We would love to do this again because we can go on for hours, obviously.
Yeah, have me back sometime. I would love to do it. You guys are great. And I'll be sure to promote this when it comes out. This was a lot of fun. This was a wide-ranging conversation.
Yeah, definitely. We appreciate it. But before we wrap up, why don't you let people know where they can find your work and how people can get involved with CPI?
Oh, sure. You can just check out my website. I'm at calebmaupin.com. I'm also on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, etc. And if you want to get involved in the Center for Political Innovation, I mean, we have a website, cpi-usa.org. So there's a forum you can register on there, or you can just send me an email, my first name, last name @gmail.com, and I'll plug you in.
Thank you, Caleb.